CEE,
Central Europe Explained,
an IDM podcast series
powered by Erste Group.
Episode 30, Empires of Disinformation Fighting Windmills. Independent journalism is the backbone of every functioning democracy. Yet for the countries of the so-called Western Balkan, the free spaces for reporting have been shrinking. Journalists often find themselves in a hostile atmosphere, often labeled by government officials or other media as traitors of the nation or as foreign agents. Resilient independent media is a precondition for the rising threat of disinformation and fake news. How do we tackle the current deficiencies of the media system and the public sphere in the region? What concrete measures improve resilience of independent journalists? Welcome to our podcast series Central Europe Explained. My name is Daniela Apaydin. I'm a research associate at the IDM and I'm hosting today's episode on the situation of independent journalism in Western Balkan countries. With me is Hana Ćopić from the Crossborder Journalism Network n-ost, based in Berlin. Hana studied German language and literature in Belgrade and has long-standing experience with capacity building and project management. Hana worked as a project coordinator for several German foundations. For n-ost, she was the responsible coordinator for the project Local Journalism, European Perspectives, with a focus on the Western Balkans in 2021. I'm very curious about this project and its outcome, but firstly, I warmly welcome Hana. It's great having you here today.
Thank you, Daniela. Thank you very much. It's nice to talk to you, and thank you very much for your invitation.
Great. Hana, before we learn more about the project that you carried out with the excellent Balkan Investigative Network, BIRN, I would like to learn more about the general situation of journalism in the region. Where do you see the main challenges for journalists at the moment, and what affects them in daily life?
Well, I'm not sure that's a very optimistic question to start with, because I think that the situation of journalists in the Western Balkans, but not only in the Western Balkans, is not something that we could describe as a very cheerful everyday life. Journalists face systematic difficulties and challenges, and independent local media, maybe even on a greater scale, that make the situation of independent media very, very serious. We are talking about lack of market regulation, about monopolization, state influence, and also very precarious working conditions. And in addition to that, the non-existent free advertising market make independent and economically sustainable media practice at the same time almost impossible. In my opinion, the fact that local media still exist in such a hostile environment is already a sign of their resilience in a certain way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for this introduction. Perhaps before we dive deeper into the topic of journalistic resilience, let me shortly explain this pretty weird political term called Western Balkans. Because when we speak about the Western Balkan countries, we mostly mean the 7 European countries: Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Kosovo, North Macedonia, Montenegro and Serbia. So we are actually speaking about a very diverse and huge region of this continent. The EU has developed a policy to support the gradual integration of these countries with the Union. In 2013, as we know, Croatia joined the EU, Montenegro and Serbia, the Republic of North Macedonia, and Albania are official candidates, and accession negotiations and chapters have been opened with Montenegro and Serbia. Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo are potential candidate countries. Now that we have a bit of an overview of this region and the countries we're talking about, Hana, your project focused, as I understood, mainly on journalists in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro and Serbia. Can you please explain us what were the reasons for choosing these countries, and what do they have in common when it comes to the topic of journalism?
Well, first of all, thanks, Daniela, again, but this time for explaining the term. I think it's very important to explain political terms. It's also a very good question why only these three countries. They are definitely connected regionally, but also connected by their languages, or rather one language and different dialects. And on the other hand, we have to make a distinction when funding projects. It's very often the case that we need to make a difference between projects that can be funded in the countries of European Union and not. And our project is supported by German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. So therefore, we created this project, first of this kind for us, with those three countries. So with the Bosnian Herzegovina, Montenegro, and Serbia.
Mm-hmm. So you already mentioned before the local journalism and the resilience of journalists on a local level. Can you maybe elaborate a bit more about that and show a bit how the project approached this issue?
Well, the approach is, we thought that local media show big potential to positively influence democratization movements and to address their own audiences that are very often not in an adequate way informed by larger media. And one very important finding for our approach was the study carried out by our project partner, BIRN, as you mentioned, it's a Balkan Investigative Reporting Network. And it was possible to analyze fundamental challenges to be addressed and improved by the project, and in order to try to strengthen resilience and make some kind of, again, capacity building of selected local media.
And how can I imagine that now concretely? Did you offer workshops, or what kind of program was behind this?
Exactly, that was capacity building, as I said, but also a very full program for almost a year. We focused on a couple of segments, on a couple of, let's say, challenges that were stated by journalists themselves in the study. So we have chosen three topics. One is financial sustainability. The second one was safe handling information, or how to handle misinformation. And of course, fact-checking and everything in the scope of that subject. And the third one was cross-border cooperation. And in between those workshops, journalists were making their own, so to say, everyday work, but connected to those subjects and connected to those, actually connected to these topics, and connected to what they have done within those workshops.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned cross-border cooperation. That sounds always like a big thing and important and so, but we all know from our daily life that this is far harder to do in practice than it looks on paper. What was your approach there, and how does it help really? What's the benefit of cross-border cooperation for the journalists on site?
I think also it's an excellent question, because we usually connect cross-border with like big stories and like huge international efforts that can take years to bring stories, but it doesn't have to be like that. And cross-border cooperation is something basically that n-ost is applying in all regions. It's our approach in all the projects that we're engaged in. And in many cases, it has shown that when collaborating in that way on such stories, media outlets can share knowledge and approaches and create a situation where their coverage can have more impact and more reach. It's only important from the very beginning to consider what form of cooperation is needed. And that's something that I learned from our workshop, because sometimes sharing research and expertise methodology can also mean collaboration. There is also one publication that I also learned a lot from. It's called Playbook. It's also an n-ost publication. And it's a kind of guide drawn from the experiences of pioneer group of cross-border journalists. And there one can visualize how cross-border projects, they don't have necessarily this kind of fixed starting point, and they can flow into new or different other projects. I think it's very didactic, and it helped me at the very beginning to better understand this kind of approach. Of course, there is always a lot to think about before one starts that kind of cooperation, but I think with a playbook, one can see how it can work on different levels and with different journalists.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning the playbook. I also took a look on the website of n-ost, and we will also share the link to it for our listeners, because it's really useful, very practical, and accessible, let's say, and I can really recommend it as well for further projects. So you also mentioned the financial aspect, and I know that's a maybe also a frustrating aspect of the topic, but it's so important, financial resources. Can you tell us a bit more about this very aspect of the workshop findings, maybe? Is there something region specific, or?
I would like to sound more optimistic and to share with you that our two trainers shared with us models of joint funding and models of crowdfunding. That was something that we worked on during the workshop. Basically, we took a method of raising funds online and tried to figure out how local media can work with that in the future. And for that to happen, of course, media certainly have to have quality content at the first place, but they also need to have their audience or audiences, their community. And we also talked how to establish this connection where local media start talking with their communities about supporting them, and that the slogan should be support media that you follow, not only in a crisis when they're maybe facing financial collapse or are under pressure and penalized for their work, but maybe the most important thing is to keep in mind that the public should understand that their support is a guarantee of media independence, and that is something that's worth of investing in. And of course, transparency is a central part of the whole online fundraising process, regardless of the chosen models, because of course, we talked about more than one. And we also mentioned some successful examples of funding that prove that once audience identifies its values with the media can count on their support on the longer run. And as example, as I said, we took KRIK from Serbia. It's a crime and corruption reporting network, nonprofit organization established to improve investigative journalism. And for example, also a portal from Croatia. It's one of the oldest independent nonprofit websites. And we took a look in their ways of work and crowdfunding campaigns that they had or still have as a membership model, for example. So no, there are definitely no recipes, and it is very contextual, as it usually is, but it's not easy to, on one hand, to seek for the money for financial support in maybe surroundings that are poorer than the others. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, but what came to my mind in this regard is when you, of course, are working for one of these newer initiatives, local ones, then often they're let's say they're founded as an NGO or also from the structure of an association. And as a journalist, you easily, I think, get into this position of not only a fundraiser for your own work, for your own job, but also in the position of an activist, especially in the region. If you get labeled as I already mentioned, as a foreign agent, as a traitor of the nation, as it was often put, or as an enemy or so, then you come in this position of defending yourself, or also of need to position yourself very much. And I wonder if what you think about this, as I call it, Angioization of journalism, and the journalist being more an activist. Do you see that critical, or is it not happening?
No, it's definitely happening. And thanks for explaining it. I mean, it's like, it's a very dangerous position because journalists as well are put in that position. Not all the people, or not that many people, are born as activists or would like to become activists. But something else is happening. Sometimes it can happen that qualitative information come from NGOs, especially if they have to take over the role of the media in some certain sense. And on the other hand, it's also logical that media use all the available financial means, like in certain structures, in order to generate their funds more easily, and or sometimes also just in order to survive. So thing with the NGOization is a very, very contextual. And I also think that what you mentioned in your question, and I think it's very important, there is this switch between objectivity in strict terms, especially for journalists, versus activism. And I think this social problem has been present in the Balkans for decades, since the 1990s, of course, and especially in those professions that per se have more public attention and deal with the public and its problems on a daily basis. One could follow this imposed transformation of becoming an activist. And people, or professions even, become activists because they're standing up for themselves, for their credibility, and credibility for their own professions. Making them into the activists is to make them, to marginalize them in a way, because in the last 30 years, the last thing that the mainstream politics in the region of former Yugoslavia needs is a critical thought. And especially if you're not using nationalistic narratives, then you, in the Balkans or in the Western Balkans, you necessarily become a certain kind of activist. Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned, from there, you're most probably gonna be a part of hate speech of some politician and be labeled as journalist, activist, representative of civil society organization, portrayed as a mercenary, traitor in the mass media or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, also here, I mean, here the challenge also for education of journalists for the future to really get sensitive for all these issues that might have not been so in the focus, let's say, a decade ago. What I also wanted to ask you about the project, I saw the format of journalism slams. Can you maybe explain what it was all about? Is it like a poetry slam, and how did you connect these two formats?
Excellent. It is, but it's not. Of course, the format leans on a poetry slam, but it's not about any kind of competition. It's about journalists going on a stage in a very informal atmosphere and having about 10 minutes to explain the background of one of their publications, like one of their stories. So from the idea to the research and its result. And so they provide an insight into the everyday life of journalistic work. And we use them as, I think it was the first time in the so-called region, like in the Balkans, to use this format, as far as I know. We made, of course, public events as well, but organized it locally in the cities where we had our workshops, and involving, of course, inviting local audience. So after a journalist tells something about his story, then there is the possibility for exchange with the audience with Q&A format. And I think this is a very, very, as I said, informal format, and I think it's very, very suitable for and communicative. And in addition to contact and confidence building with the local journalists, it focuses on media education, because audiences can learn more about journalistic work and kind of to get to know story behind the story. And I think it has a lot of potential because it communicates with the audience very directly, and has this informal and transparent methods that could contribute to gaining trust. And I also think it's a very specific situation if it's about local media, so they communicate in other way with their audiences.
Mm-hmm. Also, getting to know the journalists behind the stories, I think, is something that is very interesting for everybody who's consuming media. So yeah, it was an extremely interesting insight into this project, into the issue itself. Maybe I would like to ask you, because we do this always at the end of the episodes, ask you for a piece of art, book, music piece, whatsoever that you would like to recommend for inspiration on the topic. Do you have anything for us and our listeners?
I think I have, because speaking of all these topics and gaining maybe the best way your audience can gain insights in what we have been doing in the last 10 months is our publication that is online. So you can read a lot more details and get to know our partner media and local media in the 3 countries, and it both in local languages, but and also in English. And it's on one of Björn's websites for tools and publications. It's called bird.tools/publications, and there you can see the title of the project, and both publications. It's very recognizable. And they're online. You don't even have to download them.
Perfect. Okay, thank you very much, Hana. Thank you for your time, for giving us the insights. As usual, our listeners will find the recommendations and links later on our social media posts and descriptions. Hana, thanks a lot again for taking the time about this very important topic. This will not be the last time that we will focus on journalism. There will be further observations of the situations, not only in the Western Balkans. Please check out our previous episodes on the region. We were covering several aspects, but not only Corona related. Thank you again, Hana. Thank you for listening, and see you again.
Thanks for having me.
So, you enjoyed this podcast? Then tune into another CEE episode and subscribe to the IDM podcast series on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Acast, or elsewhere you get your podcast. And also have a look at the rest of our work on our website www.idm.at. For any feedback or podcast collaboration, feel free to contact me at e.honteberry@idm.at. The email is in the description below. This was CEE, Central Europe Explained, a podcast series produced by the Institute for the Danube Region and Central Europe, powered by Erste Group, with the ongoing participation of Daniela Apaydin, Malvin Natalik, Daniel Martinek, and Sebastian Schäfer. Production and editing, Emma Honteberry. Proofreading, Jack Gill. IDM Podcast.
Institut für den Donauraum und Mitteleuropa.
Institute for the Danube Region and Central Europe.
European perspectives.
Regional actions.
Cooperation and expertise since 1953.